Global Health students. Welcome to our Module 2 lecture on global issues. For this presentation, I had the pleasure of working with Mr. Tom Brennan, who is a global disaster and policy expert. Tom, who's worked extensively in global policy and disaster relief for more than 40 years, graciously partnered to work with me to develop this framework for our course. This description of Tom's background is more than 10 years old, but he has one of the richest global disaster relief backgrounds of anyone I know. He began as a Peace Corps volunteer right after college, going to Malaysia, where he was stationed in 1965, and he continued working in throughout many different parts of the globe, mostly for the U.S. government, but also for the United Nations organizations and the World Bank. And he lived in Jacksonville briefly before moving on to North Carolina, where he resides today, so thus he cannot join me to deliver this presentation in person. However, he's been available to respond to any questions and or concerns, so if you have anything, go ahead and email over your questions. He's passionate about these issues and he enjoys the challenges of any nature, so go ahead and prepare your questions. The purpose of this presentation is to provide you with a broad overview of the key issues facing the world today and their present and potential impact on public health. Much of what I say today may or may not be new to you, but I certainly hope that I'll be able to provide you with a construct that will help you to consider these issues facing our world in a more holistic manner. We can no longer effectively manage public health without taking a global view. Tom and I decided that we created these 8 brief PowerPoint presentation decks, with each focusing on a specific driver that impacts global public health. Please review all 8 PowerPoint presentation decks and respond to each of the questions that will come from each deck. Please make note of any questions and or discussion points and we can focus on responding to those a little bit later in the presentation. So let's move on to the picture of the globe. So here we are in the world. This is a global presentation. So we're starting off with a picture of the globe. The world began its journey a long time ago. What might be considered international commerce began actually thousands of years ago, initially centered around the Mediterranean Sea, the Arabian Sea, and the Bay of Bengal. The spice trade represented a significant part of this ancient trade. In fact, you may remember this from your studies way back years ago in high school. In fact, by 3000 BC, Kerala in South India had already established itself as a major center for the spice trade, which was plied from Somalia to the Malay Peninsula. Silk also played a major role, and the Silk Route ran from China to Europe. Marco Polo in 1261 began his journey to China to compete with the Silk Route. Then good old Christopher Columbus arrived in 1492 looking for a shorter route to India. Colonization, particularly by Britain and Portugal, and the western expansion of the United States precipitated another major milestone in global commerce. For the first time, the international movement of labor was undertaken on a large scale to meet specific economic demands in distant markets. British planters in Malay needed labor to tap their trees. A job native Malays were not eager to perform. Therefore, the planters encouraged and facilitated migration from Tamil Nadu, which was in India. Likewise, labor was brought from China to mine tin for British companies in Malay. Around the same time, the United States also encouraged labor movement from the Canton province in China to build our transcontinental railroad. The next century and a half saw continued developments in the international banking system, improvements to shipping lanes such as with Panama and the Suez Canals, large increases in global trade, the inventions of automobiles and planes, and then 25 years ago, information technology and the World Wide Web brought all these improvements together in a way never before thought possible, and the reality of the international globalization was recognized. Economic globalization, as you'll see in the center of these round circles, is defined as the increasing economic integration and interdependence of national, regional, and local economies across the world through an intensification of cross-border movement of goods, services, technology, and capital. And that's a definition we found in Wikipedia. We've placed economic globalization at the center of global issues because any effort to deal effectively with a public health issue must be economically viable if it is to be sustainable, and because economic globalization greatly influences every other issue. So here we are, economic globalization is in the center of our rubric. Before moving on, I'd also like to mention that globalization is not solely an economic phenomenon. There's also a strong cultural component that we'll refer to later in the presentation. So this is where we're going to begin. First, we're focusing on our first bubble. The key features behind economic globalization include rapid transportation, information technology, and instant, almost global communication. These combine to help manage this increasingly global economy to move money electronically around the world. People can manage their production orders from great distances. They can take classes from home, like you, or their dorm room, or from 12,000 miles away. CEOs can manage entire multinational enterprises from one location, and that can be almost anywhere. But not, for instance, in Bangladesh, Myanmar, Rwanda, and a couple other dozen countries that lack adequate bandwidth to participate fully. Even so, Bangladesh garment factories can begin doing a new dress style within an hour of its successful debut in a New York City fashion show, and workers in those factories can visit an internet cafe and communicate globally with friends and family, affinity groups, and ideologues. Economic globalization drives competition. Not only can labor move to job markets, job components can also be brought to labor pools, which we call outsourcing. And no matter how local something appears to me, it is quite possible that it can quite possibly be done elsewhere as efficiently and cheaper. And we can see that now with so many different things moving to India and to many other countries where they can be done cheaper. This is starkly demonstrated by the city of Pasadena, California, which is required by city ordinance to provide summaries of all city council meetings and to distribute these summaries to all residents of the city. This city has outsourced that entire process to a small company in India, as noted in this Associated Press article. I mean, that's crazy. Crazy. Economic globalization also leads to economic integration, both horizontal and vertical. Horizontal integration basically means it's acquisition of companies doing the same thing to become larger and larger and larger. An example of horizontal integration is the InBev Corporation. Do you know who owns Budweiser? Well, guess what? It's not an American company. It is owned by InBev, a publicly traded company located in Belgium. It's the leading global brewer and one of the world's top consumer products companies. Its brands include Budweiser, Corona, Stella Artois, Beck, etc. Another example are the pharmaceuticals like Pfizer and Ambani. Their recent merger created the biggest pharmaceutical company in the world. That's horizontal integration. Vertical integration means basically like it's a Chinese auto company buying coal mines in Australia and mineral mines in the Congo, which they use to produce cars. That is, they produce the energy to smelt the iron ore and produce the steel to manufacture the car. That's called vertical integration. So we talked about horizontal and vertical. And these are just concepts, just for background information, so don't get too hung up on them. And economic globalization leads to much greater economic growth on a global side. Now, take a look at this chart. The best part of this growth is the growth in the middle class, all around the world. As you can see, global GDP grew 200%. China increased their average per capita income from $2,000 to $4,260, an increase of 113%. And look at India, increasing 254%. And now we focus on the growth of the middle class. And this is a theme we're going to talk about throughout this semester. From 1980 to 2010, this is about a 30-year period, membership in the global middle class rose from 1.1 billion persons in the bar graph on the left, above 1980, to 1.8 billion persons, an increase of 65%. So people are moving up to the middle classes. From 2010 to 2030, only a 20-year period, the middle class is expected to grow from 1.8 billion to 4.9 billion, which is the column on the right. More than half the world population and a 216% increase during that period. How wonderful this is. A huge number of people are no longer hungry. For the first time in history of the world, a majority of the world will not be in poverty. The growth of the middle class is the most important upside of globalization. Now, I'd like to share with you the most important downside of economic globalization. Yes, the huge increase in the global middle class is both the great upside and the great downside of economic globalization. It's kind of a two-edged sword. The downside arrives from what the middle class wants, which in a word is everything. A new entrance to the middle class in India wants everything that a new member of the middle class in the United States wants. A refrigerator, a motorcycle, the hottest new mobile phone, possibly a car, a washing machine, better, richer food, and more meat, and fish in particular. And this means a much greater demand on our natural resources, much greater than the world has ever experienced. The total global energy demand is expected to increase to the equivalent of more than 17 million barrels of oil per day by 2030, an increase of more than 70% over year 2000 levels. This chart that you can see on the screen shows the proportion of that global demand that is likely to be met by various fuel sources, indicating a more than doubling of coal use, which is the tan segment of the chart, a doubling of petroleum use, which is the dark blue section of the chart, and more than a doubling of natural gas, which is the green section. Nuclear, which is light gray, and hydropower, which is the light blue color that's kind of hard to see, are expected to remain relatively stable, while biomass, which is the dark gray color, might increase its contribution by only 40%. The small red line, accounting for less than 3%, is energy expected from all other renewables, like wind power, thermal, solar, etc. And this is from, PFC Energy International. Of that demand for energy, half of that 30% increase is found in China and India. There's also a demand for water. Primarily for agriculture, there's a huge increased demand on water. They're for rice for agriculture and for better food and more meat. You need more water. So, how much water do you think is required to, let's take a look at this next chart. Look at these three charts here. Do you know how much water is required to make a hamburger? Have you ever thought about that? 2,400 liters or 600 gallons. That's 3.78 gallons per liter. That's substantial. How much water is required to make 1 cup of tea? 35 liters. Just take a look at these charts. You can stop the presentation. It's really substantial. There's also a demand for land to grow food, to build houses, um, and washing machines. This pressure on the land is causing the destruction of animal habitats and putting humans in greater contact with animals and their diseases, which is something we'll talk about later in the presentation. Another concern about the rise in globalization are the non-participating populations. This term, we call them the bottom billion, is a term first coined by Paul Collier, who is an economist, a developmental economist, who consults with the United Nations. We'll discuss the bottom billion later on. You see my beautiful chart I made here. It's not so beautiful. These are the countries that are not participating in economic globalization. They are not involved. Mongolia, Afghanistan, Nepal, Bhutan, all the countries that are colored red on this map are the ones that are not participating in economic globalization. And most of these countries, as you can see, are landlocked. They are landlocked countries. We also have the inner city and rural poor groups. These people do not have ready access to a computer nor consistent internet service. So the gap between these poor and everyone else grows and grows and grows. Another concern with globalization are the growing disparities. This article I've highlighted purple, reports that China is adding more billionaires to their ranks. That's China. Now let's look at in India. The Ambani house is a clear example of these huge disparities in India. As you can see with the gold arrow highlighting this house, this is one gentleman's house, Mr. Ambani. And in his house, it is 45,000 square feet. It's in South Mumbai in India, 27 stories, so more than 520 feet tall. They've got 600 full-time staff, parking for 168 cars, 9 elevators, 3 helipads. There's a health spa, a yoga studio, a theater, 3 floors of hanging gardens, a ballroom. This is one gentleman's house. This highlights the huge disparities in India. However, you think India and China are bad? Well, take a look at this chart, another one I've highlighted purple, the regional income inequality. European inequality lower than most. As you can see, I've highlighted in red, the income disparity in the United States is actually worse than that is found in India, even with Mr. Ambani's house, but it is better than China. We're right there, sandwiched in between. Another concern for globalization is quality control. With all of these commodities moving around the globe, particularly when it comes to medicines and food, ensuring high quality is much more difficult globally than locally. And we all see this in the news. We can all remember those articles on the front of the New York Times highlighting the products that come in from China that are that have tons of toxins in them. Quality concerns are not just found with medicine, food, and toys, but with building lumber. There was formaldehyde in them, with lumber liquidators, as you can see in the article that's highlighted white in the center. Look, there was tainted orange juice from the fruit we imported. There's just tons of different challenges with condiments and so many other issues that just don't have the same quality control that we have in the United States. Other concerns associated with globalization are the health issues, in particular, obesity, heart disease, and diabetes. You may have noted in the recent news highlighting for the first time, there's a decline in the incidence of type 2 diabetes in the United States, but globally, it's increasing dramatically, especially in places like India. This slide highlights the overweight prevalence of adults in Southeast Asia. The Vietnamese are the fittest group on this graphic. And guess what? They had their first tummy tuck in 2005. Compared with the United States, they're significantly less overweight. So, in summary, we've discussed a few critical points associated with economic globalization. Number 1, It was a long process that was greatly facilitated by information technology from what? From the World Wide Web. Number two, it has resulted in enormous economic growth, most notably within the middle class. Number three, economic globalization has had a large impact on resource demands on our good old home planet. And number four, not all countries, not all people within a country are participating in economic globalization. Non-participants lag greatly behind, and these are our disparities. And finally, the fifth key point of this section, economic globalization significantly affects health risks. So that's the end of our first section of this presentation, focusing on economic globalization.